Hi, folks. I hope you're all keeping well. My name's Kieran Nolan. I'm a lecturer and researcher at Dundalk Institute of Technology. It's great to be able to present for you today for Replaying Japan 2021. And the title of my talk is Eagle's Computer Warrior, Japanese Arcades to UK Comics via licensed coin-op to home computer conversions. So, before I start the main talk, I'll take you through my table of contents. The first item will be to introduce Eagle Comic. After that, we'll take a look at the type of toy and game promotions that were featured in that comic. Next, I'll introduce one of the stories that ran in Eagle during the 1980s and the 1990s, The Computer Warrior. This will be followed by a look at one Computer Warrior story called UN Squadron that's based on the game of the same name. And that'll be followed by a look at Street Fighter 2, a Computer Warrior story, an adaptation of the famous Capcom arcade game. And finally, I'll wrap things up with a summary and some conclusions. So, Eagle Comic itself, it was first launched in 1950 and ran until 1969. It was published from England and it introduced sci-fi optimism to the UK's adventure and war-themed comics market. And this was embodied through its lead story, Dan Dare, Pilot of the Future. So Dan Dare is part of a United Nations that expands out beyond the nations of Earth into the galaxy. And even though the original run of Eagle was wrapped up in 1969, Eagle was relaunched in 1982 by Fleetway Publications, and it brought back Dan Dare, or a descendant of Dan Dare originally, and it ran until 1994. And this second series is often referred to as the New Eagle. So on the left we can see that first issue of Eagle from 14th of April 1950, and the first page of the Dan Dare Pilot of the Future comic story. And on the cover of the 1982 issue 1, we can see this green alien is the Mechon, who's the enemy of planet Earth and Dan Dare. And there are many Mechons. There was always one to take the place of the last one. But the Mechon is the leader of these aliens that are called the Treens. Now, on the front cover, we can see that there was a free gift, a type of frisbee, and also we get some details on what was inside the comic itself. So while it was mainly comic stories, there were also interviews with sports stars, TV and radio personalities, and it was really a slice of pop culture from the UK at the time. And in very small writing on the bottom left, there's the list of different countries that this would have been exported out to and the prices. So we can see Australia, New Zealand, Malaysia, and Ireland, where I'm from. So Eagle and its publisher Fleetway, they often ran stories that were tie-ins, that were promotional pieces for different toy lines. And Computer Warrior followed this trend, except it was for locally produced computer games. And what we see here is a comic strip based on Robo Machines, which was a Bandai toy line. So the Eagle would have featured the comic story, weekly serialized story that was based on those toys, and also would have had mail-in competitions where readers could enter the draw to win one of the toys from the line. And from talking to Barry Tomlinson, the editor of Eagle, at the time, he told me that there was actually no money exchanged hands for these deals. So it was something that benefited both parties. The comics publisher, they had a new franchise that kids would recognize from having seen the toys on the toy shelves. And also, the comic was providing advertising for the toy line. So it worked both ways to the benefit of both parties. And The Computer Warrior, it was a story that ran in Eagle from 1985 until 1994. It was actually originally called The Ultimate Warrior. And this image here shows the first issue of Eagle that featured this story. And the main protagonist of Computer Warrior was Bobby Patterson, an English school kid who's summoned by the Warlord, this person you see on the right hand comic image, who looks sort of like a mix between a Viking and a samurai. And the Warlord would summon Bobby into the Nightmare Zone, where he'd have to compete against these types of demons while playing real life versions of computer games with real life stakes. And the games that were featured in Computer Warrior were published or produced normally by publishers, game publishers in the United Kingdom. And some of these happen to be home computer conversions of Japanese origin arcade games. And US Gold featured prominently, their games featured prominently in the Computer Warrior story. And it so happened that US Gold had a 10 game deal with Capcom. And one of the games that was covered by that was UN Squadron. So UN Squadron ended up becoming a featured game in Eagle that was turned into a story in the Computer Warrior strip. And what's very interesting about this, apart from the actual way that the story was adapted from just the game as source material into this original comic strip, was that UN Squadron's original form of that franchise was the Area 88 manga that was released in 1979 in Japan. So the UN Squadron story, it ran in 1990 for 9 weekly issues across 36 pages. The author was James Nicholas, which is a pen name of James Tomlinson, and the artist was Mike Dory. So sometimes the Computer Warrior stories would show the title Computer Warrior and then the name of the game. This one just shows the name of the game itself, complete with trademark symbol. The story starts off similar to most Computer Warrior stories in that Bobby Patterson is minding his own business and the Warlord summons him into the computer world where he must battle the dark forces of the Nightmare Zone. This is a different Warlord than we saw in the previous slide. This is Warlord Ball, and he introduces the scenario of UN Squadron to him, and he must fight against a group of corrupt and powerful arms dealers who are causing conflict all over the world for their own profit. And Eagle Comic featured a lot of different war stories. So to have this comic strip which had a lot of aerial combat and fighter jets, so it fitted. Now, UN Squadron, the game itself, yeah, that would have been supplied to the writer and artist. They often would get preview copies of the games, and from talking to Tomlinson, he told me that they would be given walkthroughs and cheat codes as well, so they could skip ahead and get all the details they needed. The UN Squadron release by US Gold, there's a little bit of a disjoint between what happens on the front cover and the loading screen here and the actual graphics in game, as the in-game graphics would have been unchanged from the original UN Squadron / Area 88 manga feel. So that loading screen, the characters, guy who looks sort of like a strange Tom Cruise and an unnamed pilot with the helmet on, they don't actually feature in the game. So the actual instruction booklet for UN Squadron, it's fairly simple. The character artwork is recognizable and links up with how they are represented in the game. And we also have a couple of very short paragraphs that are the scenario which the comic story would have been based on. So each of the UN Squadron characters, they were each changed to fit into the art style of Eagle Comic. Shin Kazuma is no longer the focus character. He's now a type of antagonist or rival of Bobby Patterson, and he is willing to win at all costs. Mickey Simon, don't want to spoil the story, but he doesn't stick around for too long. You can maybe guess what happens there. But again, he's drawn in a style that would be consistent with how many Eagle comic strips of the time would have been rendered. And Bobby Patterson, he took on the role of Greg Gates, Lieutenant Gates from UN Squadron. And he finds himself on missions with each of these people, and they have to go up against all sorts of obstacles and enemies. Now, there are a couple of main characters that feature in the game, but in the game itself they're not named, even though they had identities in the original Area 88 manga. So Saki Vashtal is the guy who delivers the mission details at the beginning of each level, and in the Eagle comic he's known as Commander Loquan, and he's a very serious guy who keeps a cool head when the pilots are arguing among themselves. And working alongside him is a character known as the Prof or Professor, and he's a civilian weapons expert, and he's accident prone, so he stumbles about and drops dangerous weapons, providing some kind of comic relief. But in the original Area 88 franchise, he's known as Quartermaster McCoy, and he's kind of a sneaky, unethical kind of guy. But the tone is slightly different in this. And again, this character, both of these characters, they were both given their identities based just on the source material here. So neither the artist or the writer would have had contact with or exposure to the Area 88 manga, anime, or the arcade game that this computer game was based on. They were just given the computer game, and that was all that they worked with. So UN Squadron's main focus is aerial combat, and the action from the game itself was translated over very nicely into the comic stories. James Nicholas was originally playing this game on a Commodore 64 and was able to describe the action for Mike Dory, who also had the use of screenshots to work from. And it combines realistic aircraft designs with these type of fantasy scenarios. But we can make the visual link between both images here. On the left hand side we have the 8-bit version for the Amstrad CPC, and on the right we have a few frames from the story itself. And we can see here level 3, the end of level boss scenario up against it. So it's rendered in great detail in the comic book version. You could think of it perhaps as a kind of a high def remaster, albeit in pen and ink. And it's great how the artist and writer were able to take these gameplay scenarios and low res graphics and turn them into this linear comic book story. So if we take a look at the pathway that Area 88 took to get into Eagle Comic, it started in 1979 in Japan. In 1989 got adapted into the Area 88 arcade game by Capcom Japan. This game was localized for the English speaking world and released by Capcom USA as UN Squadron because the whole mercenary scenario wasn't familiar. The franchise wasn't really that familiar to the Western audience, and it needed to simplify it down. So it's basically like, yeah, these guys are kind of like the United Nations. They're fighting crime from around the world in their jet fighters. So that was a good enough premise. And this game then, it was converted by US Gold in the United Kingdom for the microcomputers of the time, and it was this version that turned into the source material for the UN Squadron story by James Tomlinson and Mike Dory. And it's just really interesting to see how they took the material, this kind of remediated version of Area 88. It's a sort of a parallel universe version of the Area 88 franchise, one that exists within its own continuity, and that I think would be of great interest to anybody who has an interest in translations of manga from the east to the west. So, the second story I'm going to look at is the adaptation of Street Fighter II that featured in Eagle in 1993. However, Street Fighter did make an appearance on the front cover, and the story itself, it ran over 6 issues and 18 pages. And again, it was the team of James Nicholas and Mike Dory working on this. And this story, again, it's based totally on the visual materials and the game that the writer and artist had supplied to them. And once more, we have Bobby Patterson taken into the real life version of the computer game by the Warlord. And the first character from Street Fighter that he comes up against is Zangief. So Zangief, starts to pummel him. I'll just show snippets of the story here. I won't show the full thing. But the artwork is very atmospheric, quite dark actually, but it does capture that Russia level that is shown in the game. And Bobby Patterson, he keeps his normal appearance no matter what game he's in. So he's given the powers and the costume of Ryu, but he's still himself. His stature doesn't change. And the characters are drawn, again, they resemble their computer game versions, but they have that slightly realistic yet cartoony look that you would have found throughout the Computer Warrior and Eagle comic strips. And also, these illustrations would have taken some inspiration from the cover art that was supplied by US Gold to the Eagle team. So if we look at Guile's level here, Guile is kind of this hothead, and his haircut has been tamed down compared to how he's normally represented, and we've got the fighter jets swooping down. So even though this wasn't an aerial combat story, Nicholas and Dory's keen interest in military aviation is shown here. And throughout this Street Fighter story, one of the really inventive things is the use of the normally static background characters and environments that are seen in the game, and they've been incorporated into the action in very inventive manner. So for example, if you look at Dalsim's India level, these elephants in the game, you can't actually interact with the background, but upon his defeat to the Computer Warrior Ryu, the elephants start to stampede, and Bobby Patterson saves his life and he gains an ally. But these are little moments in the story, but it's just a really nice and inventive use of the visuals to help create some kind of dialogue and interest beyond the fight action itself. When Bobby Patterson finds himself brought into a fight by Chun-Li as the warlord teleports him from level to level. He refuses to engage in a fight with her. He says he won't fight a girl. So we got to remember that Eagle comic was targeted towards young boys, and the writers was being conscientious here, and they made this version of Ryu a pacifist. Eventually, he does use one fireball and throws Chun-Li onto the market arm stall from the level, and to give her a soft landing, he points out. So it's a very chivalrous Ryu, but Chun-Li's not particularly impressed by his gallant behaviour. The penultimate fight of Bobby Patterson's Street Fighter 2 adventure takes place on the Japan level, where he's blindsided by the sumo champion E Honda, who throws him into the onsen, and he gets attacked by E Honda's pet piranha fish. So this is a little bit left of field, but it's a comic book, so the creative license is there. And once again, it demonstrates how the background environments were considered as part of the story and interaction between the different characters. This continues when Bobby fights Blanka, and we can see that Blanka's artwork is based on the cover art of the game by US Gold. But we also see in his other poses that he has a slightly more realistic proportions, as with the other characters. And he kind of resembles the G.I. Joe action figure of Blanka, but in a turn that's slightly more like something out of Mortal Kombat than Street Fighter. Blanka throws Bobby into the crocodile-infested waters behind his hut, and this is one of the rare scenarios where the computer warrior actually loses on his quest, so he's banished into the nightmare zone where he must find an escape from. So there were more computer warrior stories after this, and I very much recommend checking them out. So where does this Street Fighter 2 computer warrior story fit into the timeline of Street Fighter comics? I've put together a timeline. I welcome any feedback on it at all, as there may have been some releases from Japan that I missed, but the earliest I could find was from May 1992, and this was the serialized manga series in FamiMaga magazine by Masamo Kanzaki called Street Fighter 2 Ryu. And that was in 1992, and then in February 1993 we had the Computer Warrior Street Fighter 2 story by James Tomlinson and Mike Dory. And following on from that, a couple of months later, Kanzaki's Street Fighter 2 Ryu series, the first collected volume of that, was published by Takuma Shoten, and there were two more volumes of that, the last one in 1994. In May of 1993, the first volume of Strike 2 Laughs was published. Now, I use a machine translation for this, so this may be incorrect. You can see an image of it there, and I've also included the ISBN number if anyone wants to look it up. But that was the first volume of that series, and then Kanzaki's series was released in English language translation and it was also had color added, and that was released for the US market initially and retitled just Street Fighter 2, and that saw a number of different releases in territories around the world. Also that same month in 1994, Malibu Comics in the US released the first of their Street Fighter comics. Now that was actually cancelled after 3 issues by Capcom, who weren't too happy about how the excess of violence and other features of the story, but that was actually licensed out to Escala Comics in Brazil, and they continued on doing their own Street Fighter story after that was cancelled. So they kept going with issues 4, 5, 6 and just did their own adaptations up until 1997. And As I mentioned earlier, the Kanzaki story, it was released across different territories. So in September of 1994, Manga Publishing in the UK, they republished that colorized English language translation. Also, in 1994, you had the comic version of the Jean-Claude Van Damme Street Fighter movie, and also the manga based on the animated movie of Street Fighter 2. So 1994 was a great year for Street Fighter, but you can, and then, since then you've had re-releases of the Masamu Kanzaki story by Udon Publishing, and you've had a lot of many different Street Fighter comics and variants based on the different installments, and it just continues. It's such a huge franchise. And in summary, when we're looking at thinking about how large, that Street Fighter 2 is nowadays, for Eagle to have got that franchise back in 1993 was a really huge event. Though at the time, I guess it was early days for the Street Fighter franchise, and it's interesting how both it and the UN Squadron kind of have gone under the radar, largely of the fan communities. But yeah, US Gold and Eagle Comic, there was no money involved at all when they were arranging the licenses for these stories. It was an agreement that benefited both parties. The games helped sell the comics, and the comics helped sell the games. And that's how it was done. And both stories were based solely on the gameplay and visual promotional materials. The writer, James Tomlinson, and the artist, Mike Dory, they were just relying totally on the game, on screenshots of the game, and on any kind of extra materials that US Gold presented them with. But they were working from the home computer conversions of these arcade games, so they didn't have access to the arcade machines, and any kind of material that may have inspired the arcade games, like the original Area 88 manga or any other, they just didn't have access to it. It also just wasn't something that was readily available to them, because we're talking about pre-internet here, and also while Area 88 was one of the first mangas that was released in English, it still would have been kind of a rare find in the UK at the time. And the English comic version of Street Fighter 2, A Computer Warrior Story, is the first English language comic adaptation of Street Fighter 2, and it predates by 2 years the English language translation of the Famimaga series, and also the 3-issue series that Malibu Comics released in the US. So it was ahead of the curve in that sense. And again, like thinking about Area 88 and UN Squadron, it was kind of like the concept of clean room design, where something is reverse engineered without any access to the original materials or schematics. And so this is kind of exists as a parallel universe version of Area 88 in its own continuity. And it's something that I think would be really of interest to fans of the franchise. Interestingly, Capcom no longer hold the license for Area 88. So both stories, like, they're originally distributed in print to a relatively localized distribution base, and this all happened before the World Wide Web and before digitization of comics became the norm. And until at least the time of this presentation going out, they've gone largely undetected by the Street Fighter and Area 88 fan communities. There's no mention of them at the time of making this presentation on any of the wikis or on any of the resources. If you look up Eagle and Computer Warrior, you will see the stories listed, but there's no extra detail. So I think that Eagle Comic and James Tomlinson and Mike Dory deserve great credit for doing justice to both of these franchises, and indeed for their creative work across the different game adaptations for the Computer Warrior series. So thank you very much for checking out my presentation. I want to give a mention to Barry Tomlinson and James Tomlinson for answering all of my questions about the history of Eagle and Computer Warrior. And I also want to thank SDG1 Century on Twitter for helping me pinpoint the exact start month of the FamiMaga Street Fighter 2 manga series. So look, thanks very much for checking out this presentation. I appreciate you sticking around for it, and if you have any comments or inquiries, please feel free to get in contact, and enjoy the rest of the Replaying Japan conference. Thank you.